Hello there. Tonight we are looking at Baltic mythology. We will explore the ancient beliefs of the Lithuanian and Latvian people, specifically their focus on forests, rivers, and sacred groves. In these traditions, nature functions as a central, holy force rather than scenery. We will identify the gods who ruled the sky, the thunder, and the dead. We will also describe the specific rituals people used to honor them and the beliefs they held regarding the seasons and ancestors. As always, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're settling into bed or simply looking for a calm way to drift through the past, I'm glad you're here. Now, let's begin. The first thing that existed was water. Cold, patient water, stretching in every direction, breathing mist into the empty air as if the world already had lungs and was practicing. Above it hung a darkness so thick it felt like wool pulled over the eyes. No birds, no reeds, no shorelines, only the endless hush of deep places, the kind that makes people lower their voices even when they have no idea why. In that hush, a thought stirred, then another. Then an old presence straightened its back and looked around as if it had simply been waiting for the right moment to arrive. Dievas opened his eyes. Dievas did not announce himself with trumpets. He did not need to. His name carried weight the way a stone carries weight. Quietly, without argument. He stood above the waters, and the waters accepted him. He breathed out, and the air learned movement. He lifted a hand, and the darkness thinned enough to show its own texture. It had grain, it had depth, it had corners where secrets could gather later. He looked down into the water and saw his own face reflected there, older than anything, and already tired of staring at nothing. So he decided the world would have something to look at. He scooped a handful of light and flung it upward. It scattered, and where it landed, it stayed. Stars fixed themselves in place like nails, hammered into a roof. Some shone boldly, some hid shyly behind the mist. All of them held. A world needs more than lights on a ceiling. A world needs ground. Ground is a tricky thing when the only thing beneath your feet is water that has never heard the word beneath. Dievas considered his hands, and then he called for help. He did not call an angel or a choir. He called someone who understood mud and hunger and the pleasure of a good trick. Velnius surfaced like a thought you did not mean to have. He rose from the water with a grin and water streaming off him, with eyes that kept their own counsel. People later described him with horns and hooves and all the obvious decorations, because human beings, like their dangers, dressed clearly. In the beginning, he had fewer ornaments. He had cleverness. He had appetite. He had a curiosity sharp enough to cut. Dievas spoke first. Velnius listened with the kind of patience a fox uses when the henhouse door is left open. Dievas told him the world needed land. Velnius laughed once, low and pleased, and agreed as if this was all a game he already expected to win. So Dievas pointed down into the black water and told him to dive, to bring up what lay hidden beneath. Velnius inhaled and disappeared. The surface closed over him. The mist folded itself like a curtain. Time passed. It is hard to measure time in a place that has no mornings, so the story measures it with waiting. Dievas waited. The stars waited. The water waited. Then Velnius burst up again, sputtering and triumphant, spitting out clods of dark earth, as if he had stolen them from a miser. He held a mouthful too, cheeks swollen, eyes bright with secret satisfaction. Dievas took the earth that Velnius offered and scattered it over the water. Where it fell, it floated, it gathered. It clung to itself with the stubbornness of clay. Small islands formed first, like stepping stones for a god who disliked getting his feet wet. Dievas pressed them with his palm and they widened. He breathed on them and they dried at the edges. He placed them carefully, dotting the waters, setting the first coastline in place with a craftsman's calm. Then he noticed the hills. They rose where no hills had been planned. There were lumps and ridges and stony spines, sudden as knuckles under skin. Dievas narrowed his eyes and looked at Velnius. Velnius smiled with his mouth still full. Velnius had kept some of the earth for himself. It bulged behind his teeth. It tasted like ownership. He planned to hide it away, to spit it out later into his own private corners, to make places where sunlight would struggle and people would lose their way. Dievas's gaze held him. The kind of gaze that makes even the boldest trickster swallow hard. Velnius choked. He coughed. He spat. The stolen earth flew out in ugly chunks, and where it landed it made mountains. It made boulder fields. It made the crooked spines of hills that break a straight road into a wandering one. Some of it fell back into the water and sank, and those places became bogs, thick and hungry, where a man can step forward and never step out again. Velnius wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, looking offended, as if he had been robbed. Dievas said nothing. The world now had roughness. The world now had traps. The world now had character, the sort that makes stories possible. Land alone is only a promise. Dievas wanted life to keep its promises. He crouched and pressed his fingers into the fresh soil. He drew long lines with his nails, and they filled with water. Rivers learned how to run. He cupped his hands and poured, and lakes formed, calm and watchful. He pushed his palms into the ground and lifted, and in the lifted places the earth rose to meet the sky. He set stones down like teeth so the land could bite back at the sea. He liked balance. He liked the idea that the world could offer bread and also demand respect for every crumb. Velnius watched all of this with a look that suggested approval and also plans. In some tellings, he could not resist adding his own touches. He dragged a tail through the wet clay and left gullies and ravines. He threw stones into the rivers just to see the water argue around them. He laughed when the first whirlpools formed. The laugh stayed. Even now, when a stream gurgles where it should have been silent, people remember Velnius's amusement. Dievas then planted the great tree. He planted it the way a man plants a staff, firmly, as if he expected it to hold him up. The oak took root at once. Its roots dove down into the dark, wet places. Its trunk thickened, its branches climbed, leaves unfurled like 1,000 small green tongues tasting the air. It grew so fast the sound of it was like fabric tearing, like bones stretching, like the world making room for itself. It stood at the center of things, a spine for the new earth, a ladder for whatever would someday want to travel. Birds did not yet exist, yet the oak already felt like it had always belonged. Dievas laid a hand on its bark, and the bark warmed under his palm. He glanced at Velnius, perhaps thinking of how this tree would drive roots into the places Velnius loved most. Velnius shrugged as if to say that even trees had to learn to mind their own business. Light came next, because life needs an audience. Dievas lifted a bright ember of his own making and shaped it with careful hands until it became a disk of gold. He set it in the sky, and it flared, bold and immediate. Sal woke, and her waking was dawn. She did not drift into the world. She arrived. Her face filled the heavens, and her glance touched the damp earth until it began to steam. Where her gaze fell, mist lifted and revealed shape. The new rivers shone. The new hills cast shadows. The bogs glistened like dark eyes. Saul rolled her shoulders as if she had just put on a magnificent cloak. She looked down and smiled, and that smile told the world it could start doing things. Saul needed a path. Dievas gave her a chariot, bright as fresh metal, and horses that snorted sparks. Each morning she climbed in and drove across the sky. Each evening she reached the western edge and dipped down, disappearing beyond sight. People later argued about where she went. Some said she sailed under the world in a boat of copper. Some said she walked beneath the earth through a hidden road, with shoes made of amber so the underworld could not claim her. Some said she rested in the branches of the great oak, hanging her belt on the highest limb like a woman coming home after a long day. The stories differ because the sun looks different depending on whether you stand on a hill or in a marsh, whether you are warm or hungry, whether you are in love or grieving. Still, Sal returned. Every time. She carried her own faithfulness in her hands, and the world depended on it. Night required its own ruler, because darkness also has duties. Dievas shaped a silver disk and set it in the sky opposite the sun. Menelaus rose, cool and watchful, with a gaze that did not warm the skin yet still pulled at blood and water. He made the sea breathe higher on some nights and lower on others. He made wolves lift their heads and think complicated thoughts. He made lovers speak more softly. He made thieves more confident. Under Menelaus, things hidden in daytime learned boldness. Velnius liked that. Velnius tilted his head at the moon and grinned, as if he had found an ally. The moon did not grin back. The moon rarely shows teeth. It simply watches and moves. Dievas filled the sky with smaller lights to keep Menelaus company, and to keep the night from swallowing everything too easily. The morning star flashed like a blade. The evening star glimmered like a promise. Constellations took shape slowly, as if the stars enjoyed taking their time choosing what they wanted to resemble. Hunters looked up and saw tools. Mothers saw cradles. Old men saw roads. Children saw monsters. The stars accepted every interpretation, which is another way of saying the stars did not care. They were placed there to endure. Then Dievas turned his attention back to the earth. Light and land meant little without breath. He walked across the fresh ground, and wherever his foot touched, grass pushed up like green hair through skin. He stretched out his hand and forests rose. Pine trees climbed straight and proud. Birches flickered pale in the sunlight like bones turned to wood. Alders gathered by rivers. Oaks stood as if they had been waiting for a proper family to join them. In the wet places, reeds hissed secrets. In the dry places, wildflowers shook their heads in the wind as if they had heard something ridiculous. The earth filled with scent, resin, damp soil, flowers sharp as honey. The world began to smell alive, and that was a powerful change. Even Velnius paused to inhale, as if he wanted to taste the world before humans arrived to ruin it with smoke and sour beer. Animals came as the forests thickened. The first bear lumbered out of a shadow and shook itself, sending leaves flying. A wolf followed, lean and focused, already thinking in packs. Deer stepped lightly through the undergrowth, ears twitching. Birds at last took to the sky and claimed the branches of the great oak for themselves, squabbling and singing as if they had always owned it. The stork arrived with long legs and an expression of patient superiority, the sort of creature that looks like it has opinions about family life. The swan glided on lakes with a quiet dignity that made people later decide it belonged in stories about lovers. Fish filled rivers. Eels wriggled in muddy pools like living ropes. Every creature carried its own small myth in its body. People later learned to read them. Even so, the world still felt empty in the way a house feels empty before anyone has laughed in it. Dievas understood this. He understood that stones and trees and animals make a fine landscape, and landscapes still need witnesses. He gathered clay from the riverbank, the good sticky clay that holds the shape of a thumbprint. He rolled it between his palms and shaped it into a figure. Arms, legs, a spine, a head tilted upward as if it already wanted to look at the sky. He breathed into it. The clay took in the breath and became warm. The figure blinked and saw Saul shining down. The first person stood up, shaky and astonished, and immediately felt hunger because life arrives with demands. Dievas made more. He made them in pairs and in clusters because loneliness drives people to strange acts. He made them with different faces and voices because variety makes gossip possible. He set them near water because thirst is a cruel teacher. He watched them learn fire by imitating lightning and by stealing sparks from the branches after storms. He watched them burn their fingers and swear and laugh. He watched them learn to build shelters with branches, then with logs, then with the confidence of creatures who believe they will live long enough to need a roof that lasts. He listened to their first songs. The songs sounded like wind and worry and joy. Their language grew around them like moss on stone, soft at first, then thicker, then hard to scrape away. Velnius watched them too, and his gaze lingered longer than Dievas's did. Dievas could afford to look away. Velnius could not. Humans were entertaining. Humans were breakable. Humans wanted things with an intensity that made them easy to steer. Velnius crouched at the edge of the firelight and listened to their stories before they even knew they were telling stories. He learned their fears. He learned their weaknesses. He learned their hunger for luck, their hunger for answers, their hunger for shortcuts. He smiled at the way they jumped when an owl hooted. He smiled at the way they argued over whether the shadows moved on their own. He made a quiet promise to himself. He would always have a place in their world. He would always have a corner of their minds. Dievas remained above, distant and steady, like the sky itself. People would call him father, and fathers often receive the kind of respect that comes with absence. They would pray to him when they wanted order. They would thank him after the harvest when bread filled the house. They would curse him in winter when the cold sharpened its teeth. Dievas would hear all of it the way the sky hears, shouting, calmly, without flinching. He had done his part. He had set the world in motion. He had placed Saul on her road. He had given Menelaus his slow power. He had planted the oak that joined every height to every depth. He had allowed roughness to exist, because a smooth world gives nothing to the hands. He had let Velnius spit out mountains, because hills make good hiding places and good lookout points, and both matter. The first dusk settled. Saul reached the edge of her path and lowered herself into the west, leaving behind a red smear like fresh blood on the horizon. The air cooled. Shadows lengthened. Menelaus lifted his pale face. Wolves began to sing their thin, wild songs. Humans huddled near their fires. inventing courage one breath at a time. Somewhere in the marsh, a frog croaked, and its small sound seemed to fill the whole world, because the world was still young and every noise mattered. Velnius moved through the reeds without a splash, enjoying the new darkness. Dievus watched from above, silent as the stars he had set in place. The world had begun. It would keep beginning every morning, as long as Saul drove her chariot, and as long as people opened their eyes and felt the familiar shiver of being alive. A storm came in from the west at midday. Low clouds covered the sun and turned the fields dim. Wind bent the birches until their branches scraped and rattled. Rain hit the thatched roofs in hard sheets. Smoke from cooking fires drifted sideways and thinned. People pulled doors shut, dragged livestock closer to barns, and stacked extra wood by the hearth. A dog ran under a cart and stayed there. Then lightning flashed above the tree line, bright enough to show every wet leaf for an instant. Thunder followed and rolled across the hills in a long, heavy sound that kept going after the light vanished. Perkunas arrived with that thunder. People described him as a broad man with a red beard and a weapon in his hand, a hammer in some songs, an axe in others. They said he rode above the forests in a wheeled cart that shook the air with every turn. When he passed, lightning appeared in sharp, crooked lines and struck the ground. Trees split, stones cracked. Fires started in dry grass after the rain eased. In the middle of the downpour, a bolt hit an oak at the edge of a clearing and tore a strip of bark down the trunk. Splinters flew outward. The smell of fresh wood and smoke mixed with wet earth. A farmer crossed himself with trembling fingers and spoke the thunder god's name under his breath, because he wanted the storm to pass without taking his house. Perkunas moved in straight lines. He searched for Velnias during storms, and people linked each bolt to that hunt. A flash in the far marsh meant Perkunas had seen movement among the reeds. A strike on the hill meant Velnius had climbed too high. When thunder sounded close enough to shake the roof beams, mothers pulled children against their chests and told them to stay quiet. Their words stayed simple. They said Perkunas worked. They said the thunder meant danger and order at the same time. They said the devil hid in hollow trees and under stones, and the thunder god broke those hiding places open. In the morning after the storm, people walked to the edge of the field and looked at the scorched patch where lightning had struck. They found a split stump or a burnt stone. They touched the blackened surface and pulled their hands away fast. They spoke softly. They left a small piece of bread there, or a few grains, because they wanted Perkunas to keep passing over their land and to keep looking elsewhere when his temper rose. Dievus remained above all this, distant and steady in the songs. People spoke his name with a different voice than they used for Perkunas. They used Perkunas when the roof shook and the air flashed white. They used Dievas when they stood in a field at sunrise and checked the soil with a thumb. They used Dievas when they counted their children and their livestock. They used Dievas when they wanted the world to stay in its proper shape. The old stories placed Dievas high in the sky. They gave him a long coat and pale hair. They placed him on a road of light that crossed the night sky, a road people pointed at on clear evenings when the stars appeared thick and bright. They said he walked that road slowly, with a staff in his hand. They said he watched. They said he spoke rarely. They said his sons carried out his work with more noise. Perkunas served as the loudest of those sons, the one who made himself known with heat and light and the smell of struck stone. A storm ended near evening. Rain thinned into a cold drizzle and then stopped. Clouds broke apart in patches. Saul showed again, low and bright, and her light fell on puddles and turned them to sheets of gold. Water ran from roof edges. The air smelled of crushed leaves and wet hay. People stepped outside and looked up, checking the sky as if the storm might change its mind. A child ran barefoot through the mud and laughed. A man pushed a cartwheel that had sunk into the ground and swore when it refused to move. A woman carried a bucket to the well and watched the water ripple as her rope pulled it up. Life went on because life always went on. Still, the storm left marks. A branch lay snapped on the path. A fence leaned. A chicken moved in tight circles as if it had forgotten where the coop stood. Every mark reminded people of Perkunas, and every reminder asked for respect. They respected him in ways they could manage. They kept oak wood for special fires. They treated certain old oaks as sacred and avoided cutting them. They chose clearings near those trees for offerings during festivals. They poured beer onto the ground. They burned bits of fat and watched the smoke rise in straight lines if the air stayed calm. They placed stones in small piles at the edge of a field, and they spoke names over those stones. Some men struck 2 stones together to make sparks and let the sparks fall into dry tinder. They watched the flame catch, and they said Perkunas had given them fire. In villages, older people warned children against whistling indoors during storms. They said that sound drew attention. They said attention brought lightning. They said the thunder god disliked foolishness. People carried these rules in their bodies the way they carried the memory of a sharp slap. Saul traveled each day in full view of everyone. People watched her rise and cross the sky. They watched her light stretch across the fields and slide into the forest. They watched her reach the west and sink down. In the stories, she rode a chariot with bright horses. The wheels shone. The horses ran without slowing. She held reins in her hands and kept her posture straight. At dawn, she appeared on the eastern edge of the world, and her light pushed shadows back under trees and into hollows. Frost on grass melted. Birds began calling. Smoke rose straight from chimneys again when the wind eased. At midday, her light stood high and hard, and people worked faster to finish tasks before evening. At sunset, her chariot lowered and touched the water in the west. The water reflected her light in long streaks. Then she disappeared from sight. The songs gave Saul a household. They gave her daughters and servants. In Latvian singing, Dieva daily rode with her or followed behind her. They appeared as young men in clean clothes, sometimes with swords, sometimes with bridles, sometimes holding a boat oar. They moved across the sky and looked down at the earth. In some verses, Saul washed her face in the sea at dusk, and the sons of Deves waited for her at the shore. They held out a towel and a comb. They helped her climb back into her chariot for the next day. People spoke these lines while working. Women sang them while weaving and while washing clothes in cold river water. Men sang them while cutting hay and while mending nets. The words stayed close to daily work because daily work matched the sun's schedule. Menelaus rose after Saul left. His light came in a cooler color and fell across the ground in a thin sheen. Water shone. Frost appeared earlier under his light. Faces looked pale. Shadows sharpened. Under his light, a person could walk a path and still see stones and roots, and that mattered in a forest where a fall could break a leg and end a life. People counted time by him. They watched his shape grow and shrink. They linked the full moon to certain tasks. They chose nights for travel and nights for staying close to home. They watched dogs bark at empty corners of a yard and they blamed that behavior on the moon. They watched wolves appear at the edge of a clearing and stand still with heads raised, and they remembered the same pale light in a wolf's eyes. The old tales placed Saul and Manulis in a marriage. The marriage began with a wedding that filled the sky. Saul wore bright clothing. Manulis appeared with silver on his hands and a fine belt around his waist. Stars gathered close. People later said the morning star appeared as a guest, or Seklis in Latvian songs, or Shrinia in Lithuanian, bright and sharp in the east before sunrise. The wedding lasted a single evening in the stories, because stories keep moving. Saul and Manulis lived together for a time. Days followed nights with a steady pattern. Seasons turned. Fields ripened. Then the marriage broke. Manulis saw Oshrinia and followed her. In some songs, he met her near the edge of the sky just before dawn. In others, he met her near water. Oshrinia appeared bright and quick. She kept moving. Manulis pursued her. Saul found out. The stories showed her standing in her chariot at dawn, holding the reins with tight hands, watching her husband move away from her path. She did not cry in the old lines. She showed anger in her posture and in the words she used. The situation pulled Perkunas into the conflict because Perkunas enforced rules. Perkunas disliked broken oaths. He disliked disorder between sky powers because disorder in the sky spilled down into the fields. One night, a storm formed without rain. Lightning flashed across the dark sky in long lines. Thunder sounded and repeated. Manulis hung above the trees, bright and round, and his light fell on the tops of pines. Perkunas drove his cart overhead. He raised his weapon. In the stories, he struck the moon. After that strike, people looked up and saw the moon's shape change. A dark cut appeared along one side. The full disk did not return immediately. Nights passed. The moon grew again, and then Perkunas struck again. People used this pattern to explain the moon's phases. The story gave a reason with faces and action. It gave a punishment with a visible result. It gave Saul a form of justice without giving her a simple reunion. Saul continued her travel. She rose each morning. She crossed the sky. She sank each evening. She carried heat into late spring and early summer. She carried weak light into winter, and people watched her path stay low and short then. They built their lives around those changes. They stored grain and smoked fish. They cut wood. They repaired roofs. They chose spouses and held weddings during seasons with long days because work and celebration fit better then. During dark months, people stayed closer together. They told stories. They sang. They listened for wolves beyond the village. They watched the moon through cracks in shutters. They watched the stars. Dieva daily appeared again and again in those songs, often near water. In one set of verses, Saul crossed the sea at evening and sank too far. Her chariot slipped. Her horses struggled. The water reached up to the axle. Dieva daily rowed to the shore. They carried a boat and pushed it into the water. They rowed out. They lifted Saul back into the chariot. They brought her to land. The action stayed direct. People liked this image because it showed help arriving in time. It also placed the sea as a border that could swallow even the sun, and that felt familiar to anyone who had watched a storm drive waves hard against rocks. The sea had its own powers in Baltic belief, and people spoke of Mother Sea in Latvian songs. They described her as a woman who lived under the water, with long hair and heavy clothing. They described her hands closing around ships. They described her giving fish and taking lives. Fishermen went out anyway because their children needed food. They kept small rituals. They threw a first fish back into the water sometimes. They spoke a name over it. They watched the water's surface and judged whether it looked calm enough. They knew calm water could change fast. They carried that knowledge into every story of Saul sinking and rising again. Perkunas also held a place in daily lore. People blamed him for lightning. They credited him for rain. They also linked him to judgment. When a person stole from neighbors, elders sometimes spoke of Perkunas as a witness. When a person lied in a public meeting, someone might glance at the clouds and tighten his mouth. The fear of thunder served as a leash on behavior. It worked because it felt immediate. Anyone could hear thunder. Anyone could watch lightning strike a tree and split it. Anyone could smell smoke and see a fire start. People did not need priests or books to understand that. They only needed to stand outside during a storm and watch. Velnius stayed present even in this chapter of sky powers because he moved where people moved. He appeared in old tales as a figure who offered bargains. He offered a quick way to gain money or cattle. He offered a way to win a court case. He offered a way to heal a sick child. He asked for payment. He asked for a soul or a promise or a piece of a person's future. People told stories where a clever farmer tricked him, where a priest drove him off, where Perkunas chased him into a bog. People listened and laughed because laughter served as another leash. A person who laughed at the devil felt braver for a moment. Bravery helped on nights when wolves called close and the moon shone bright enough to show a shadow moving between trees. As the years passed in the telling, the sky remained busy. Storms crossed the land. Thunder sounded. Lightning flashed. Saul crossed overhead in her daily route. Menulus rose and changed shape. Stars appeared and vanished behind clouds. People watched and worked. They gathered hay. They hunted. They buried their dead. They named children after bright powers, after the sun, after thunder, after stars. They carried amulets carved from wood or bone. They kept pieces of amber from beaches and wore them on strings because amber caught light and looked warm against skin. They placed carved signs on doors. They respected old oaks. They moved carefully around sacred groves. They carried these habits across generations because habits kept a village alive. On a clear night after harvest, a group of men sat on a bench outside a house and drank. The air stayed cold. Their breath showed when they spoke. The moon hung above the trees in a bright half shape. Stars filled the gaps between branches. One man lifted his cup and pointed. He traced the moon's curve with a finger and said Perkunas had cut him again. Another man spat into the grass and said Menulus never learned. A third man laughed and said Saul still drove her chariot at dawn, and that fact mattered more than a husband's behavior. Their laughter sounded rough. They drank. A dog barked once and stopped. Far off, a wolf answered. The men fell quiet for a moment. Then they talked again, because speech pushes fear back a little. Lightning struck the edge of a pine stand and split the trunk from crown to roots. Bark flew in strips. Resin ran down the fresh wound. A sound followed that made the roof beams tremble. In the yard of a small farmstead, a man stopped mid-step with a bucket in his hand. The water inside sloshed over the rim and ran down his wrist. A cow in the byre kicked once against the wall. Chickens pressed into the corner of their coop. A child held a wool blanket up to his face and watched through a gap, eyes wide, breathing fast. The man set the bucket down and walked to the doorway, because he wanted to see where the next strike would land. He saw cloud cover moving low and fast. He saw rain coming in sheets. He saw the pale flash of another bolt, far off over the marsh. He spoke one word, short and careful: Perkunas. The storm moved over the fields and into the forest. Thunder followed in repeated bursts, close enough to make the ground vibrate underfoot. A thin stream on the edge of the woods rose fast and ran brown. Leaves and small branches floated along the current. A deer broke from cover and ran across a clearing, head low, legs slipping in mud. In the village, people shut shutters, tied doors, and put extra logs close to the hearth. One woman pushed a bench against a wall that had a crack from last winter's frost. Another woman pulled a pot from the fire and covered it, because she did not want sparks to leap out if the wind shifted. An old man with a crooked back walked from house to house with slow steps and told people to keep away from large oaks until the storm passed. He carried a small cloth pouch at his belt. Inside were bits of dried herb and a smooth stone with a burn mark. He showed the stone to a boy and told him it came from a lightning strike. The boy reached out, then pulled his hand back when the old man raised his eyebrows. The old man did not smile. The boy stayed quiet. In a wet hollow beyond the village, Velnius stood beside a pool with reeds around it. Rain ran off his shoulders and down his arms. His hair clung to his head. He crouched and held out a hand, palm up, and watched water collect in the lines of his skin. A black cow stood near him, head lowered, rope trailing in the mud behind her. The cow's flank rose and fell with fast breaths. Velnius reached for the rope and wrapped it around his fist. He looked toward the village lights that glowed faintly through rain. He moved his mouth as if tasting the air, then pulled the cow forward. His feet sank into mud and came out with a sucking sound. The cow resisted for a moment, then stumbled, and Velnius tugged again. He did not hurry. He had time. He had patience. He had taken cattle before. He had taken horses too. People found the tracks in the morning, and they found the torn rope ends, and they blamed wolves if they wanted to sleep again. They blamed Velnius if they wanted to stay awake. A bolt struck closer. Light flashed against the wet reeds and turned each drop on each stalk into a bright point. Thunder came almost at once. Velnius lifted his chin and looked up. Another flash. Another crack. Velnius tightened his grip on the rope and stepped backward into the reeds, pulling the cow after him. The cow's hooves sank. The cow snorted and shook her head. Velnius gave a short laugh and kept pulling. He moved deeper into the wet ground, where a person could lose a boot with one careless step. He knew every hummock and every hidden pool. He chose his path by memory. He heard the storm coming nearer. He heard the sound of something moving high above, and he turned his head as if he had heard a cartwheel roll on stone. He lowered himself into a crouch and pushed the cow's head down with one hand to keep it quiet. The cow resisted, then yielded, shaking with fear. Perkunas arrived above the marsh in a burst of light. The flash lit the entire hollow for an instant. In that instant, the reeds threw thin shadows across the mud. The pool's surface showed a hard white glare. Velnius's face showed clear, teeth bared, eyes wide. Then darkness returned, and thunder hit like a blow. A second bolt struck the edge of the hollow. A tree cracked. A limb fell. Water leapt in a spray where the bolt hit near the pool. Velnius jerked back. He let go of the cow's head and dragged the rope hard, pulling the animal deeper into cover. His foot slipped, and his knee hit the mud. He swore and pushed himself upright. He moved faster now. The cow stumbled and almost fell, then found footing again. Velnius kept going, hunched low. Rain ran into his eyes. He blinked hard and wiped his face with the back of his wrist. A flash lit the reeds again. Perkunas's cart appeared above the hollow for a moment. Wheels visible, body visible, weapon raised. The next thunderclap came with a second flash, and the bolt landed close enough to throw clumps of mud into the air. Velnius flinched and threw his arm up over his head. The cow bellowed and lurched sideways. The rope snapped tight. Velnius yanked and dragged her back, teeth clenched. He looked for cover. He saw an old oak at the edge of the marsh, trunk wide, roots raised like knuckles from the ground. He chose it without thinking. He pulled the cow toward the oak and pressed her against the trunk, using the tree as a shield. The cow trembled. Velnius pressed his shoulder to the bark and listened for the next strike. Lightning hit the oak. The bolt cut down the trunk in a bright line. Bark burst outward. Wood splintered. A smell rose that stung the nose. The cow screamed and twisted away, ropes sliding through Velnius's wet hands. Velnius shouted and grabbed again. His fingers closed on the rope, and the rope burned his palm as the cow jerked. The tree split along a deep crack. A section of trunk tore loose and fell into the mud with a heavy thud. Velnius threw himself sideways to avoid it. The cow broke free and ran, rope trailing behind. Velnius landed in the mud on his side. He rolled and pushed up. Rain poured down his face. He looked toward the fleeing cow and made a choking sound of anger. Then another flash hit close, and he stopped chasing. He turned and ran in the opposite direction, deeper into the reeds and toward a line of low hills. The chase carried on for hours. Rain eased, then returned. The cloud cover shifted and left brief gaps where the moon showed as a pale curve. Lightning flashes lit the woods again and again. Perkunas struck trees, rocks, and patches of open ground. Each strike left a scorched mark and a smell that lingered after the light vanished. Velnius ran through narrow deer paths, slipped under low branches, and pushed through thickets that tore at his clothes and skin. He left scratches on his arms. He did not stop to wipe blood away. He kept moving. He heard thunder overhead. He heard the cart wheels again and again. He guessed the direction by sound and by the timing between flash and strike. He altered his course when the strikes came too close. He climbed a slope with wet grass and loose stones. His foot slid, and he caught himself on a birch trunk. He shoved off and kept climbing. At the top of the slope, Velnius reached a patch of high ground with scattered boulders and short pines. Wind hit harder there. It pushed rain sideways. Velnius bent forward and put his hands on his knees, breathing hard. He looked back toward the forest. A bolt struck low in the trees. Another strike followed near a stream. The flashes showed brief shapes, trunks and branches, water spray, leaf clusters. Velnius spat and straightened. He moved toward a boulder large enough to shelter him. He pressed his back against the stone and turned his head to listen. Another flash lit the hilltop. The sound came at once. Perkunas had closed the distance. Velnius took a handful of wet soil and smeared it across his face and hands. He crouched lower behind the boulder. He pulled his knees to his chest and held still. Wind carried the smell of smoke from somewhere down slope where a strike had set dry needles burning under a pine. The fire was small, and rain kept it from spreading fast. yet it gave off a sharp smell. Velnius watched the edge of the boulder and waited. Lightning flashed again. In that flash, he saw Perkunas above him, standing with feet planted wide, weapon raised, hair and beard wet, eyes fixed on the hilltop as if searching for a moving shape. The next strike hit the ground nearby and threw dirt into the air. Velnius ducked his head and covered his ears. The thunderclap hit hard, and the sound made his jaw tighten. Perkunas stepped forward and planted one boot on a rock. He scanned the hilltop. He turned his head slowly from left to right. He took 2 steps and stopped. He raised his weapon again. Velnius stayed still behind the boulder and kept his breathing shallow. Rain ran down his nose and dripped from his chin into the mud. He held his mouth closed. A pine branch snapped in the wind. Perkunas turned toward the sound and moved that direction. Velnius waited until Perkunas's back faced him. Then he slid sideways on his belly and pushed himself around the far side of the boulder. He stayed low and crawled toward a cluster of rocks. His hands pressed into wet grass. His elbows soaked through. He moved slowly, keeping his body close to the ground. Lightning flashed. Perkunas turned back toward the boulder. In that brief light, Perkunas saw a dark shape moving low on the hilltop. He raised his weapon and swung his arm. A bolt came down in a jagged line and struck one of the rocks beside Velnius. The rock cracked and split. Sharp fragments flew. One fragment cut Velnius across the cheek. Blood ran down into the mud. Velnius made a short sound through clenched teeth and sprang up. He ran full speed toward the edge of the hill, feet slipping on wet grass. Perkunas followed at once. Another bolt struck in front of Velnius and ripped up a strip of ground. Velnius jumped it. His foot caught the edge and he stumbled, then recovered. He reached the slope down and threw himself into a run that turned into a slide. Mud coated his legs. Stones jabbed his shins. He kept going. Down in the forest, the rain thinned. The air still held moisture. Leaves dripped. Velnius ran between trunks with no pauses. He headed toward a creek where the ground dropped into a narrow channel. He reached it and leapt, landing on the far bank with a slip and a hard impact. He grabbed a sapling and used it to pull himself upright. Behind him, lightning flashed again and struck the hilltop. Thunder followed. The flash showed Perkunas at the edge of the slope, weapon raised, shoulders squared. Velnius did not look again. He ran along the creek bed where the bank rose on either side, giving him partial cover. Water ran fast in the shallow channel. He splashed through it and sent droplets in a spray. The creek turned and wound through the trees. Velnius followed every bend. He hoped the water and the trees would break the line of sight. A strike hit the creek bank behind him and collapsed a section of earth into the water. Mud and roots slid down. The creek choked and swirled, and water rose around the new debris. Velnius ran faster. He reached a place where the creek passed under a fallen tree. The trunk lay across the channel, thick and slick. Velnius ducked under it, water up to his thighs, and felt bark scrape his back. He came out the other side and kept moving. His breathing came in harsh bursts. His legs began to burn. His hands shook from strain. He still ran. People in the villages heard the storm and tried to read it. An old woman sat near her hearth and listened to the timing of thunderclaps. She counted on her fingers. She decided the chase had moved toward the northern bogs. She told her daughter to keep the door shut and to keep a bowl of water ready in case lightning started a fire in the roof. The daughter nodded and fed another log to the fire. A man in another house drank and listened. He said Velnius had stolen another cow again. His brother told him to keep his voice down. The man snorted and drank again. A child in that house asked what Velnius looked like. The brother told the child to stop asking questions. The child kept asking. The brother described horns, a tail, and hooves, because those details helped a child draw a clear picture. The child pictured it and pressed closer to the fire. In the morning, the storm ended. Clouds broke apart. Sol rose and shone on wet fields. Puddles reflected the sky. Smoke rose from chimneys again. People stepped out and inspected the damage. One man found his fence down where a tree had fallen. Another man found a burnt patch near his barn where lightning had struck close. A woman found a dead crow near the road, feathers wet and stuck together. The old man with the pouch walked to the edge of the forest and found the split oak by the marsh. He touched the torn bark with a careful hand. He stepped around the scattered wood. He found black scorch marks. He found deep grooves in the mud where something had run hard through the reeds. He followed those marks for a short distance and then stopped. He did not want to follow further. He turned back toward the village and said Perkunas had passed close. People listened. They nodded. They spoke Perkunas's name again, quiet and respectful. Velnius stayed alive. He always stayed alive in the stories, because people kept finding lost cattle, cracked stones, and burnt trees. They kept hearing thunder. They kept seeing lightning. They needed an enemy for Perkunas to chase. They needed a reason for storms to strike unevenly across fields. They needed a face for the misfortune that arrived without warning. They kept the story sharp by keeping it physical. A burnt stump, a dead animal, a missing cow, a man who slipped in a bog and came out covered in black mud, shaking, eyes wide, saying he heard laughter from somewhere near the reeds. Perkunas kept returning as well. Storm after storm crossed the land through spring and summer. Thunder rolled, lightning struck, rain fell hard and then eased. The fields drank and grew. Rivers rose and then dropped. The cycle continued, and people lived inside it with the habits that kept them alive. They kept oak groves. They kept offerings. They kept rules during storms. They kept stories that placed Perkunas above, weapon raised, chasing a running figure through wet reeds and over broken ground. A fire burned on a low hill beyond the last fence of the village. Men carried armloads of oak and stacked the logs into a square frame. Women brought birch bark and dry twigs in baskets. The wood sat wet from recent rain, so they split thicker pieces and laid the pale interiors facing upward. A boy knelt and arranged shavings into a tight nest. Smoke from nearby chimneys drifted across the field and mixed with the smell of damp grass. People spoke in short phrases. They pointed, they lifted, they set things down. A dog circled the pile, sniffed, and backed away. On the ground beside the wood lay a body wrapped in linen. The cloth held tight around shoulders and feet. A rope kept it from loosening. The dead man's face stayed covered, because the family wanted the last sight to stay inside the house, not out here on a windswept hill. The oldest woman in the group stepped forward with a wooden bowl. She poured beer onto the ground in front of the pyre. The liquid darkened the soil and soaked in. She held the empty bowl in both hands for a moment. Her fingers trembled from cold and age. Then she set the bowl down and picked up a small loaf of bread. She broke it into 3 pieces and placed them on the earth. She placed a pinch of salt beside the bread. She placed a small slice of fat on top. The offerings looked ordinary. They came from a kitchen shelf. They came from a butchered pig. They came from work. That mattered. People trusted things they could touch and eat. People carried the same trust into their gods. A man with soot on his hands stepped up and struck flint against steel. Sparks fell into the shavings. He leaned close and blew. A thread of flame caught and ran along the bark. He added twigs. The fire grew with quick snaps and little pops. Smoke rolled low at first, then rose straight when the wind eased. Heat spread across the front of his face. He stood and stepped back. The others watched. A woman tightened her shawl around her shoulders. A child reached for her hand. She held his fingers hard enough to make his knuckles pale. They lifted the body and laid it on the wood. 4 men took a corner each. They moved slowly. The linen dragged across bark and caught on a knot. One man freed it with a tug. They set the wrapped figure down in the center, with the head turned toward the east. A younger woman placed a small clay cup near the chest. Another placed a knife. A third placed a comb made of bone. Someone slid a coin under the cloth near the hand. The coin made a small clink against the cup. The sound carried. People heard it and went quiet again. The oldest woman crouched and touched the ground beside the pyre with her fingertips. She pressed her fingers into the wet soil and lifted them, leaving 3 small grooves. She spoke a name in a low voice. Shemina. She spoke it as if she addressed a person standing close enough to hear. She kept her eyes on the ground while she spoke. Then she stood, wiped her fingers on her skirt, and stepped back into the group. The fire took the lower logs first. Flame ran along bark and climbed into gaps. Smoke thickened. The linen began to darken. The smell changed. The wind shifted and carried it toward the village. A man turned his head away and swallowed. Another man spat into the grass and stared at the ground with fixed eyes. A woman took a strip of cloth from her pocket and held it to her nose. Nobody stopped the fire. Nobody asked for a different ending. People came here because they had followed an old rule, and because the dead man's family demanded the rule be followed exactly. The story of Sovijas shaped that rule. People told it in houses at night, close to the hearth, after children fell asleep and after the last chores ended. They told it as a plain sequence of events, with practical details, because practical details kept a person listening. Sovijas lived as a man among men. He hunted, he ate meat, he cut with his own knife. He walked in forest shade and stepped over fallen trunks. One day he went out and took a wild boar. The boar ran through brush and into a clearing. Sovijas followed and drove his spear into the animal's side. The boar squealed. Blood ran onto leaves. Sovijas put his weight on the spear and held the boar until it stopped moving. He knelt, cut the belly open, and cleaned the animal. His hands grew slick with blood. He wiped them on grass. He carried meat home. Soon after, Sovijas died. Death arrived the way it arrives for everyone. His breathing stopped. His skin cooled. His mouth fell open. His family washed him and laid him on a bench inside the house. They covered mirrors and closed shutters. They placed candles nearby. They called neighbors to help, because one house rarely handled a death alone. His sons stood near the bench. They stared at their father's face. They blinked and kept blinking. Their eyes looked red. They buried him in the earth. They carried him out and dug a pit. They lowered him down. They filled the hole with soil and stamped it flat. They placed a stone at the head. They went home and ate little. They lay down and slept in broken pieces. Servegus returned in the night. He came to his sons while they slept. He stood at the foot of the bench with dirt on his clothes and soil in the creases of his hands. He looked at them and spoke. He said the earth pressed hard on his body. He said worms crawled over his skin. He said the cold entered his bones. His sons sat up with sweat on their faces. They rubbed their eyes. They saw him and froze. Servegus held his hands out. Soil fell from his fingers onto the floor. He spoke again and told them to change the burial. They listened. They rose at dawn. They dug him up. They carried the body out again. This time they placed him in a hollow tree, in a place where the trunk had split and formed a natural cavity. They covered the opening with bark and moss. They went home again and waited. Servegus returned again. He stood in the same place. Bark clung to his shoulders. Small insects moved in his hair. He said the wood held dampness. He said the cold stayed. He said the insects bit him. His sons stared at him with wide eyes and empty mouths. Servegus spoke with a flat voice. He told them to try fire. They built a pyre like the one on the hill. They gathered oak. They stacked it. They placed their father on the wood. They lit it. Flame took the logs. Heat rose. Smoke rolled into the sky. The body burned. Ash fell. Bones cracked. When the fire died down, they raked the remains into a clay urn. They placed the urn in the ground or on a shelf, depending on local custom. Then they went home. Servegus returned a third time. He stood in the doorway and looked different. His clothes looked clean. His face looked calm. He told his sons he had found rest. He told them the fire had warmed him. He told them the fire had carried him to a better place. He spoke with an even voice. His sons sat still and listened. They wanted to ask questions, yet their tongues stuck to the roofs of their mouths. Servegus turned away and walked out through the door. He did not return in the same way again. After that, people spoke of Servegus as a guide for the dead. They said he knew the way. They said he moved between houses and graves. They said he recognized each soul by voice, because he had once been human and had once sat by a fire with others. The story also spoke of gates. It said, Servegus traveled through the underworld and came upon 8 gates. Each gate stood closed. Each gate carried a guard. Servegus tried to pass. He pushed and pulled. He called. He waited. He made it through one, then another. The story counted the gates because numbers gave structure to fear. At the 9th gate, he called for help. One of his sons came and opened it for him. Servegus stepped through and entered deeper ground. People described that underworld in physical places they knew. They spoke of low caves where water dripped from stone. They spoke of narrow tunnels where a man had to turn his shoulders sideways. They spoke of pits where roots hung down like ropes. They spoke of damp air that made a torch burn low and smoky. They spoke of insects and the sound of running water. They spoke of mud that clung to boots and made each step heavy. They spoke of the smell of wet stone and rot. When a person lived near bogs and forests, those details felt more believable than gold halls and marble stairs. Velnius ruled much of that underground in the stories. People imagined him in different forms. Some pictured a man with a broad back and heavy arms, wearing dark clothes that stayed damp. Some pictured horns and hooves. Some pictured a creature with a blunt face, thick lips, and eyes that watched without blinking. All versions shared the same habits. Velnius hid. Velnius listened. Velnius waited for someone to step wrong. He lived under stones and inside hollow trunks. He moved through marsh fog and appeared on paths at night. He approached travelers who carried sacks of grain or a pouch of coins. He offered a bargain in a friendly voice. He held out a hand. He asked for a promise. A man once walked home late after a market day. He carried a sack of salt and a bundle of cloth. The road ran through trees. The moon gave enough light to see the pale trunks of birches. The man heard a sound behind him, a footstep in the leaf litter. He stopped. The sound stopped. He turned and saw a figure standing at the edge of the path. The figure wore a cap, pulled low. The man tightened his grip on the sack. The figure raised a hand and spoke in a calm voice, offering to carry the sack for a time. The man looked at the figure's boots. They looked clean. The road ran wet and muddy. The man stepped back. He spoke a short refusal. He kept moving. He heard the footstep again, closer this time. He reached into his pocket and held an iron nail in his fist. The nail bit his skin. He kept walking until the trees opened and he saw the first fence of his village. He stepped through the gate and looked back. The path stood empty. People told that sort of story without decoration. The story fit their lives. It matched their roads. It matched the way fear arrived in a forest at night. It also matched the way a person took comfort in a small piece of iron pressed into a palm. The gods in this chapter lived in earth and under earth, and people met them through soil, graves, fire, and the dark spaces between trees. A funeral pyre burned. Ash fell, an urn cooled. A table stood set for unseen guests. A door stayed unlatched for a time. A man carried an iron nail and reached home with sweat on his back. A woman screamed once, loud enough to wake the dog. Then she screamed again, shorter this time, with her hands gripping the edge of a bench. The room smelled of sweat, boiled water, and wet wool drying near the hearth. A midwife knelt between the woman's knees and kept her sleeves rolled up. Her hands moved with steady practice. She wiped the woman's brow with a cloth and spoke short instructions. An older sister stood near the door with a bucket and a towel. She watched the midwife's hands and tried to keep her own hands from shaking. Outside, snow lay in a hard crust. The wind pushed against the log walls. The roof creaked once. Inside, the fire burned low, and a pot of water sat close to the coals with steam rising in a thin line. The child arrived in a sudden rush. The midwife lifted the newborn up and held it for a breath, checking the color of the skin, the shape of the mouth, the movement of fingers. The baby's chest rose, then fell, then rose again. A cry came out, sharp and wet. The mother made a short sound that was half laugh and half sob. The midwife cut the cord with a small knife, wiped the baby's face, and wrapped it in linen. She set the child on the mother's chest. The mother's hands closed around the bundle with clumsy urgency. The older sister stepped forward and pressed her palm to the baby's back through the cloth. She felt the small movement. She nodded once, hard, as if she had received an order. In the corner of the room, near the hearthstones, 3 women stood close together. None of the others had heard the door open. None of the others had seen footsteps in snow outside. They wore simple clothes, linen and wool, with their hair covered. One held a small bundle of flax. One held a wooden spindle. One held a knife with a narrow blade. The midwife glanced toward them for a moment and then looked back down at the mother and child, as if she had decided that looking longer would cause trouble. The 3 women came closer without hurry. They stood at the foot of the bench. The one with the flax pulled a few fibers loose and rolled them between her fingers. The one with the spindle twisted the flax and wound it, slow and tight. The one with the knife leaned in toward the child and lifted the edge of the linen wrap. She looked at the baby's face. Her eyes stayed calm. She touched the baby's forehead with the tip of her finger. The baby's cry softened into a small grunt. The mother watched the women with wide eyes. She did not speak. The three women spoke in low voices, too low for the older sister to catch the words. The midwife kept her head down and cleaned her hands in the bucket, as if her work required total attention. When the three women stepped back, the one with the spindle tucked it under her arm. The one with the knife wiped the blade on her sleeve. The one with the flax tied the last loose fibers into a small knot and placed it on the hearthstone. Then they turned and walked to the door. The latch lifted without a sound. Cold air entered in a quick gust. The dog growled once and stopped. The three women went out. The door shut. The latch fell into place. The midwife exhaled through her nose and reached for a cup of water. The mother shifted the baby higher on her chest and held the bundle close. The older sister stared at the hearthstone where the knot of flax sat. She did not touch it. She did not move. People spoke of Lima on nights like this. Some spoke of her as one woman. Some spoke of her as three, and named them Lima, Kata, and Dekla in Latvian songs, or spoke of Lima together with other fate women in Lithuanian telling. People kept the details consistent in the way people keep details consistent when they need them to stay steady. The fate women arrived at birth. They looked at the child. They spoke. They left. The child grew into the words. That was the rule, and people followed rules they could not bend. A father might drink and boast and shout at his neighbors. He still kept his voice low when the midwife said Lema had come. A grandmother might slap a boy for stealing apples. She still set out a cup of beer and a slice of bread near the hearth after a birth. A mother might complain about the price of salt. She still hid the scissors and needles because she did not want sharp metal left out when fate women walked through her house. The hearth stayed central in every house because it fed the body and warmed the hands. A fire burned there every day of the year. In the morning, a woman stirred the coals with a stick and added dry wood. In the evening, she spread the embers out and covered them with ash so they would stay alive until dawn. She kept the fire from dying because relighting it took time and risk. Sparks jumped. Smoke filled the room. Children coughed. A careless hand got burned. A fire that stayed alive made life easier. People treated that fire like a member of the household. They fed it. They cleaned around it. They guarded it from water and from careless feet. In Lithuanian houses, people spoke of Gabija as the keeper of that fire. They described her as a woman the size of a child, with soot on her face and red cloth around her shoulders. Some said she appeared as a cat that slept near the heat. Some said she appeared as a small figure that sat by the coals and watched. In many houses, people spoke to her as if she stood close enough to hear. They said good evening when they banked the embers. They asked for protection when they heard wolves in the distance. They set a small piece of bread on the edge of the hearthstone. They poured a few drops of beer on the ash. They kept their movements careful, because a careless kick that scattered coals could start a house fire, and because they believed Gabija disliked disrespect. One winter evening, a girl carried a pot of stew from the fire to the table. She stepped too close and her skirt brushed the edge of a coal. The cloth caught and began to smoke. The girl yelped and slapped at it with her palm. The flame went out. A burnt spot remained, round and black. The girl's mother grabbed her wrist, checked the skin for burns, then pushed the girl toward the bench. The mother pulled the pot back to the hearth and set it down. She looked at the burnt spot on the skirt and then looked at the hearth. She took a pinch of flour and sprinkled it into the ash. She took a piece of bread and set it down with 2 fingers, gentle. She spoke Gabija's name once. Her voice stayed flat, as if she had rehearsed it. The girl watched her mother and kept her mouth shut. The stew cooled a little on the table. Nobody complained. Hunger always returned. A burned house did not return. The spirits of the house did not stop at the hearth. In some homes, a small creature lived in the corner behind the grain bin, where dust gathered. People called it by different names and described it in different shapes. Some said it looked like a thin man with a beard. Some said it looked like a bird with bright eyes that blinked too slowly. Some said it looked like a shadow that moved against the wall even when nobody walked past. This creature brought trouble when it felt ignored. It knocked over bowls. It made milk sour. It made a baby cry at night. It also brought luck when it felt fed. A woman left a spoonful of porridge in a small dish near the grain. She left it before bed. In the morning, the dish stood empty. The woman felt relief and did not speak of it outside the house. She still told her children to keep their hands off the dish. She still scolded them for laughing too loudly near the corner. Children laughed louder when told to keep quiet, and then they cried later when something pinched them in the dark. In Lithuanian stories, an Aitvaras visited certain houses. People described it as a creature that flew at night, sometimes as a fiery streak in the sky, sometimes as a bird with a long tail, sometimes as a snake that moved through the air. A man who wanted wealth fed it. He cooked pancakes and set them on a plate near the chimney. He placed a bowl of milk beside them. He shut the door and waited. On the next day, the man found a few coins under the bench, or found a sack of grain fuller than it had been the day before. He smiled and said little. He bought new boots. He bought a better knife. He bought more beer. His neighbors watched him with narrowed eyes and asked questions. He shrugged and said he had worked hard. Everyone in the village worked hard. The neighbors talked at the well. They talked near the sauna. They talked during funerals and weddings, because people talk at every event that keeps them together. The man kept feeding the Aitvaras because the coins kept coming. His wife frowned when she cooked extra pancakes in the middle of the week. She did it anyway. She placed the plate near the chimney with tight lips. One night she woke and heard a scratching sound near the roof. She sat up and saw a faint red glow in the corner near the stove. She held her breath. The scratching stopped. The glow faded. She lay back down and stared at the ceiling. In the morning, she found a dead mouse near the threshold, stiff and twisted. She swept it out with a broom and rubbed her hands hard on her apron as if that could remove the feeling from her skin. The man found a silver coin under the bench and grinned. He put it in his pocket and walked out whistling. His wife watched him go. She said nothing. She kept the children close that day. Fields carried their own spirits, and people met them during work that bent backs and blistered hands. In late summer, when grain stood tall and dry, men and women cut it with sickles and stacked it in sheaves. The air filled with chaff. Sweat ran down spines. Flies gathered on faces. Children ran between stacks until someone shouted at them. As the work went on, people watched for a sign called jumis in Lithuanian custom. It appeared as a double ear of grain growing from one stalk, or as two ears pressed close together. When someone found it, they stopped cutting for a moment and called others over. They held the stalk up and showed it. They spoke with pleased voices. They tied the stalk with a piece of red thread and set it aside. Sometimes they braided it into a wreath. Sometimes they placed it above the door. Sometimes they carried it to the barn and hid it among the stored grain. They believed it brought a fuller harvest, and they acted as if belief required a physical object. People often believe in what they can hold. A young man once found jumis near the edge of a rye field. He lifted the stalk and turned it in his fingers, checking the shape twice. He called his mother. She walked over with her sickle in one hand and a rag in the other. She wiped sweat from her face and leaned in. She nodded. Her eyes softened. She took the red thread from her pocket and tied the stalk. The young man grinned and looked around to see who had watched. A neighbor woman raised her eyebrows and smiled with a knowing expression. The young man's grin tightened. He liked luck. He also liked the idea that everyone saw he had found it. His mother tucked the tied stalk into her apron pocket and went back to cutting. Her hands moved fast again. The sun stayed hot. The work stayed heavy. The sign stayed small and real in her pocket, pressing against her hip as she moved. Forests held spirits that kept a wider distance from the hearth and the barn. People entered forests to cut wood, to hunt, to gather berries, to find mushrooms. They entered with knives, with baskets, with dogs, with caution. They knew how quickly a path could disappear among trees. They knew how quickly a person could circle back to the same stump again and again. They knew how easily a fog could hide a familiar clearing. They carried these facts in their legs and in their shoulders, and they turned them into stories about beings who lived among trunks and under roots. In Lithuanian telling, Lormias appeared near water and near forest edges. People described them as women with long hair and pale skin, sometimes with animal feet, sometimes with hands that looked normal, until a person stood close and saw the fingernails too long and too hard. Some said Lormias wore clean linen and carried combs. Some said they wore nothing and moved with their hair covering their bodies. Many stories placed them near a river where women washed clothes. A Lormi sat on a flat stone and beat linen with a wooden paddle. Her arms moved with steady rhythm. Water splashed. The linen slapped against stone. She did this work as if she lived inside it. A woman passing by saw the figure, froze, then stepped backward into the reeds. The woman held her basket tight against her stomach. She watched for a long moment, then turned and walked away without making a sound. When she reached the path, she ran. Lormias also appeared in barns and near cradles, and those stories carried a darker tone. A baby cried at night. A mother rose and walked to the cradle with tired eyes. She lifted the child and felt the body go limp in her arms, then go stiff again. The baby's face looked strange in the firelight. The mother's heart beat faster. She checked the child's mouth, the child's hands, the child's hair. She saw something that did not match her memory. She backed away from the cradle and reached for a rowan branch hung above the door. She held it in one hand and the baby in the other. She called out loud for her husband. The husband woke with a start and grabbed his knife. He came to the hearth in 2 steps. He looked at the baby and saw the same wrongness. He did not ask questions. He pulled the sauna door open and let cold air in. He set the baby down on the threshold for a breath, as stories instructed, because the sudden chill forced the hidden creature to react. The baby screamed. The scream sounded too harsh. The husband raised the rowan branch and struck the floor beside the baby once. The mother stood with her hands over her mouth. Then the baby's face shifted, and the husband's own child appeared again. red-faced and wailing, with spit on her chin and tears in her eyes. The husband lifted her up and pressed her against his chest. He rocked her until her cry softened. The mother sank onto a bench and began to shake. In the morning, the family hung more rowan above the door and placed iron near the cradle. They did it without discussion. They did it as a routine, the way people mend a roof after a storm. In Latvia, stories named Ragana as a witch who lived outside the village and knew herbs, milk, and sickness. Some tales made her an old woman with grey hair and a bent back. Some tales made her a younger woman with strong arms and a sharp mouth. People described her house in physical terms. It stood near a stand of alder trees. Smoke rose from its chimney. A fence leaned. A black cat moved along the fence rail with slow steps. A pile of bones sat near the back wall, from rabbits and chickens and fish. Ragana came to market sometimes with a basket of dried plants. She sold them with a flat voice. She watched buyers with steady eyes. A man bought a bundle and joked to hide his fear. Ragana did not laugh. She counted the coins, placed them in her pocket, and walked away. When a cow stopped giving milk, neighbors whispered Ragana's name. When a child developed a rash that spread fast, neighbors whispered Ragana's name. When butter failed to form in a churn, neighbors whispered Ragana's name. Some of these problems came from spoiled feed and dirty water and poor luck. People still wanted a person to blame. A named enemy made anger easier to carry. A named enemy also made a solution easier to imagine. A woman might carry a bowl of milk to the crossroads and pour it out. She might do it at dusk. She might look over her shoulder while she poured. She might hurry home and shut her door. The next day, if the cow gave milk again, she felt relief. She told nobody what she had done. She still slept better. Lema did not limit herself to birth. People said she attended weddings. A bride stood in a yard wearing a wreath of flowers and a wool skirt woven with bright stripes. Her hair lay braided down her back. Her hands trembled while she held a cup. The groom stood beside her with a belt tied tight around his waist. He looked toward the guests and tried to keep his expression steady. An older woman stepped forward and lifted the bride's chin, as if checking a horse. She nodded and spoke a blessing. In some houses, women left a small offering for Lema on a shelf, a piece of bread or a coin. They did it before the wedding procession left the house. They did it while guests talked and laughed outside, because the house held its own rules. Lema's presence meant the future would follow a shape. People wanted that shape to include healthy children and full barns. They acted accordingly. On midsummer night, people lit fires on hilltops. They carried torches from the hearth and placed them into piles of wood prepared earlier. Flames rose. Sparks flew upward and vanished. The smell of smoke covered the smell of grass. Young men jumped over the fire in quick leaps. Their boots landed hard on the far side. Young women followed, skirts lifted in their hands to keep cloth from catching. Some couples jumped together, hands clasped tight. They laughed when they landed. Older people watched and drank. Someone played a simple tune on a pipe. People sang. They kept singing even when their voices grew hoarse. In the dark beyond the firelight, the forest stood close. People believed beings moved there. They believed lawmies watched the celebration. They believed witches walked farther from the fire, counting the couples, choosing targets. People threw salt into the flames. They threw herbs. They tied wreaths and floated them on water to see where they drifted. They walked into the woods to search for a fern flower. a thing said to appear only on that night. They walked with a friend or a lover, because walking alone felt too risky. A boy walked into the woods on midsummer with a knife at his belt and a wreath on his head. He had drunk beer behind his father's back and felt bold. He pushed through ferns and brush and followed a deer path until the fire sounds faded behind him. He stopped when he realized he could not hear singing anymore. He listened. He heard frogs near a pond. He heard a bird call once. He heard his own breathing. He moved again and reached a small clearing with a flat stone beside a stream. A woman sat on the stone, combing her hair. Her hair hung long and wet, and the comb moved through it with slow strokes. She looked up and saw the boy. Her eyes stayed bright in the dim light. The boy stopped. His mouth opened, then closed. The woman set the comb down and stood. She took one step toward him. The boy backed away. His heel caught on a root and he stumbled. The woman smiled with her lips only. She lifted her hand and beckoned once. The boy turned and ran. He tore through brush. Branches slapped his face. He kept running until he saw the fire again on the hill and heard singing. He ran into the circle of light with his chest heaving. His friends laughed and asked what he had seen. The boy shook his head and said he had tripped. He did not mention the woman by the stream. He did not walk alone in the woods at night again. These spirits filled daily life because daily life offered endless entry points. A child cried. A fire burned. A cow gave milk. A storm split a tree. A woman gave birth. A man got lost on a forest path. People built actions around these moments. They poured beer onto soil. They left bread near the hearth. They hung rowan above a door. They tied a double ear of grain with red thread. They spoke names in low voices. They did it with hands and objects, because hands and objects stayed available even when answers stayed out of reach. Waves struck the beach in steady sets, and foam slid back over pebbles and wet sand. A line of pines stood behind the dunes. Their trunks rose straight, and their needles held droplets from a recent squall. A fisherman named Castitis walked along the waterline with a net folded over his shoulder and a knife at his belt. His boots sank a little with each step. He watched the surface for fish movement near the shallows. He carried a small sack for his catch. The wind pushed salt spray into his face. He wiped it away with the back of his hand and kept going, because a man who feeds himself from the sea learns patience fast. He cast his net where the water turned darker, near a cluster of rocks. The net opened and fell, and its weights pulled it down. He waited, counting his breaths, then pulled the line in hand over hand. The net came up heavy. Silver bodies thrashed and flashed in the thin sunlight. He crouched and shook them into his sack, then reset the net. He worked through the afternoon. He did not sing. He did not pray out loud. He kept his eyes on the water and his hands busy. When the day began to dim, he turned back toward the dunes with a half-full sack and a tired back. He heard a sound from the water behind him. He turned. A shape moved just beyond the shallow break. It stood upright where the water should have reached a person's chest, and it moved with controlled steps as if the seabed formed a smooth floor. Castitis narrowed his eyes. The figure came closer, and he saw the outline of arms and the pale gleam of skin. The figure climbed onto a flat rock, water running from hair and clothing. The clothing looked like woven strands of seaweed and fine fabric, heavy with beads that caught the last light. The woman stood still and faced him. Her hair lay dark against her shoulders, and small pieces of green weed clung to it. Her eyes held steady on his face, as if she expected him to explain himself. Castitis stepped back once. His heel hit a pebble and rolled. He regained balance and tightened his grip on the sack. The woman lifted her hand. Her fingers were long and clean, nails short. She pointed toward the fish in the sack, then pointed toward the water. Castitis understood the gesture. He set the sack down and opened it. He lifted a fish out with both hands. Its body flexed and slapped his palm. He carried it to the water and threw it back. It hit the surface and vanished. He returned to the sack and took another, then another. He emptied the sack until only scales and water remained. The woman watched without moving. When he finished, she stepped off the rock and walked closer until the water reached her ankles. She stopped at the edge of the wet sand and looked at his face again, close enough for him to see a small scratch on her cheek, as if a shell had caught her skin. She spoke his name. Castitis froze because he had not said it. He asked her how she knew it. She spoke again and gave her own name, Duratia. The sound carried cleanly over the water. Castitis looked toward the dunes and back at her, as if he expected someone else to step out from behind a pine and laugh at him. Nobody appeared. Jurati took a step closer and held out her hand. Her palm faced up, empty. Castitis stared at her hand and then at her eyes. He placed his fingers in her palm. Her skin felt cool from the water. Her grip closed gently around his fingers, then tightened enough to make it clear she could pull him forward if she chose. She pulled him forward. Castitis stumbled once, then found footing. His boots filled with water. He tried to pull back and found her strength held him. He opened his mouth and made a short sound. Jurati did not respond with words. She kept walking. Water rose to his knees, then to his waist, then to his chest. He gasped when cold water hit his skin under his shirt. He tried to breathe steadily. Juratia moved without hesitation. Castitis kicked and swam when the ground dropped away. He kept his eyes open and saw green strands and floating debris. He saw fish flick past his face, his ears filled with water, and muted the surface sounds. Jurati's hand stayed locked around his wrist. She pulled him down and forward. The water changed. Light from above thinned. The pressure in his ears increased. Juratia kept moving. Castitis's lungs began to ache. He tried to twist free. Her fingers tightened and held him in place. Then the water around his face cleared, and he felt air against his mouth. He coughed and sucked in a breath. He opened his eyes and saw a space under the sea with no water between him and the air. He saw walls made of amber. They rose tall and smooth, with layers that caught light in honey colors. Inside the walls, small trapped bubbles and dark specks appeared like insects or seeds. The floor was sand packed hard. A corridor led deeper. The air smelled of salt and resin. Castitis stood bent forward, hands on knees, coughing. Jurate walked ahead as if this place belonged to her. She turned and watched him until his breathing steadied. Then she walked deeper into the amber halls. Castitis followed because he saw no other path. He stepped carefully. His boots left wet prints that slowly faded on the sand. Light came from above through the amber walls, filtered and warm in color, and the glow made his wet clothes shine. He reached out and touched the wall with his fingertips. The amber felt hard and smooth. He pressed harder. It did not move. He pulled his hand back. Jurati led him into a wider chamber. Amber columns held the ceiling. A pool of clear water sat in the center. Shells lay in piles near the walls. A table stood with carved legs, made of wood that looked dark from long soaking, and its surface held a bowl of berries. Castitis stared, because berries did not belong under the sea. Jurati picked one up and ate it, then held another toward him. Castitis hesitated, then took it and chewed. The berry tasted sharp and sweet. He swallowed and looked at her again. Jurati's face stayed calm. Her mouth moved in a small smile. She walked around the chamber and touched objects as if checking them. Castitis stood in the center and turned slowly, taking in the space and the amber walls and the strange air. Days passed in that amber place. Castitis slept on a bed of woven reeds and soft skins. He ate fish cooked over a small fire that burned in a stone bowl. He watched Jurati move through the halls and speak to servants who appeared and vanished through side passages. Those servants kept their eyes down. They carried baskets of shells and wet cloth. They poured water into the pool. They removed ash from the fire bowl. Castitis asked questions. Jurati answered some with short phrases and gestures. She showed him a window of amber that looked out into open water. He pressed his face to it and saw fish moving by, slow and steady. He saw a seal pass close and turn its head toward the amber wall as if it had seen its reflection. Castitis thought of his village. He thought of his mother and her hands smelling of smoke. He thought of his neighbors and the way they watched each other at the well. He thought of his boat pulled up on the sand. He told Jurati he needed to return. He pointed toward the surface. Jurati listened. She sat on a low bench with her hands in her lap. When he finished speaking, she stood and walked toward him. She placed her hands on his shoulders. She looked at his face for a long moment. Then she kissed him. Her lips felt cool, and the taste of salt stayed on them. Castitis closed his eyes because the kiss left no room for thinking. When she pulled back, she kept her hands on his shoulders. Her fingers pressed firmly through wet cloth. Castitis breathed in and out. He reached up and held her wrists. He did not pull her hands away. He kept them there because he wanted them there. That moment tied him to the amber halls more securely than any door or chain. News moved fast among gods. Pacunas heard of it. The thunder god watched from cloud cover and saw the sea surface during a calm day. He saw a fisherman's boat left unattended on the beach. He saw villagers pacing and pointing at the water. He heard their talk carried on wind. He did not need their talk to understand the problem. Jurati had taken a mortal into her home. She had kept him there. She had touched him. She had kissed him. Pacunas held rules like tools. He used them. He enforced them. He decided the sea needed a lesson that would reach shore and stay in memory. A storm formed by late afternoon. Clouds rolled in fast and lowered until they covered the sun. Wind pushed waves into taller sets, and the water began to hit the rocks with loud impacts. Fishermen on the shore pulled boats higher onto sand. Women gathered children and walked them back toward houses. Dogs barked and ran in tight circles. Trees bent. Rain fell in cold sheets. Lightning struck the sea in bright flashes that showed white foam on the wave crests. Thunder followed in repeated blows. People on shore crouched and kept their heads down, because a bolt that hits water close to shore can kill. Under the sea, the amber halls lit in sudden pulses from above. Castitis stood in the main chamber, with his hands on a table, bracing himself. He felt vibrations through the floor. He heard dull sounds, like heavy impacts against stone. Jurati entered the chamber at speed. Her hair hung loose. Water dripped from it. She grabbed Castitus's hand and pulled him toward the corridor. He stumbled and followed. The corridor shook. Small amber fragments loosened from a joint in the ceiling and fell, tinkling against the sand. Jurati looked up and tightened her grip. Castitus opened his mouth to speak, and another impact cut him off. The girls backed away until reeds blocked their legs. Egli stood alone on the bank with wet cloth at her feet and a snake on top. She felt the cold water drip down her arms. She felt her heart beating fast. She spoke again and tried to make the snake leave. The snake repeated the demand. Egli looked toward the path that led back to the village. She pictured her family waiting. She pictured returning without clothes and trying to explain. She pictured her father's face. She pictured the laughter that would follow her for years. She made a quick decision. She said yes. She said it to get her clothes back. She said it to end the moment. The snake slid off the pile and disappeared into the grass. Egli and the girls returned home. They told her family what happened. Her brothers laughed at first, then stopped when they saw Egli's face. Her mother crossed herself and spoke a prayer. Her father said the whole thing sounded like a childish story. He told Egli to forget it. Egli tried to forget it. She slept that night and woke in the morning and went about her chores. Near midday, a sound came from outside. People shouted. Animals bleated, dogs barked, and ran in frantic arcs. Egli stepped out and saw snakes moving across the yard. Dozens of them, sliding through grass and over the packed earth, as if they had been sent with purpose. They moved toward the house door. They moved toward Egli. Her brothers grabbed sticks. They swung and struck at the snakes. The snakes kept coming. Her mother screamed. Her father yelled at the brothers to stop, then yelled again to keep striking, then yelled again because he did not know which action would work. The snakes filled the doorway. They coiled on the threshold. A larger snake appeared among them, head raised. It spoke in the same clear voice. It said it had come for its bride. It said its name, Gilvinus. Egli stood with her hands pressed against her skirt. Her face had gone pale. She walked forward. Her brothers grabbed her arms and tried to pull her back. Egli shook them off. She looked at the snake and spoke again, asking for time. Gilvinus agreed. He gave her a set of tasks. In some tellings, he demanded she bring 3 items, each difficult to obtain. Egli listened and nodded. She carried out the tasks with help from her family. They tried to trick the snake. They tried to replace her. They dressed a goat in bridal cloth. They sent a servant girl. They sent another. Each time, the snake rejected the substitute. It spoke the bride's name again and waited. Egli watched the attempts fail. She watched the snakes return each time, persistent, filling the yard again. She realized the demand would not fade. She stopped resisting. She prepared herself. She put on clean clothes. She braided her hair. She kissed her mother and father. She held her brother's hands and then let go. Gilvinus led her to the water. Snakes moved around her feet as they walked, and the ground seemed to shift with them. Egli stepped into the river. Cold water rose around her legs. She kept walking. Gilvinus moved ahead, and the snakes followed. The water deepened. Egli began to swim. Her hair loosened and floated around her head. She tasted river water and coughed. Then the water changed around her. She felt air against her face and found herself in a place beneath the water with space to breathe, much like Castitis had found under the sea, though this place held different textures. Stones formed the walls. Green weed hung in curtains. Shells lay scattered on the floor. Light filtered through water above and moved in shifting patterns on the stones. Gilvinus stood in front of her in the shape of a man. His hair hung wet. His skin shone with moisture. His eyes held a steady look that did not blink often. Egli stood dripping and hugged her arms around herself. Gilvinus spoke to her in a calm voice. He called her his wife. He led her to a chamber with a bed of soft reeds and a low table with food laid out. Egli ate because hunger arrived in her body even during fear. She chewed slowly and swallowed. She watched him across the table. He watched her back. Their marriage began in that place. It continued because days kept arriving. Egli bore children. She gave birth underwater with other women helping, women with wet hands and firm grips. The children grew and learned to walk on the stone floor. They learned to swim and to stand in air spaces underwater. They learned the rules of that household. They also learned their mother came from the surface, because Egli spoke of the village and the sun and the smell of smoke from a hearth. The children asked to see it. Egli held them close and remembered her mother's hands and the yard and the sound of her brothers laughing. She felt a pull toward the surface that did not fade. After years, she asked Gilvinus for permission to visit her family. He listened. He agreed. He gave her a phrase to use at the water's edge to summon him and the path back. He warned her to keep the phrase secret. He warned her to speak it only herself. Egli promised. She took her children and rose to the surface. She walked back into her village with wet skirts and a tired face. Her mother cried when she saw her. Her father stood with his mouth open and then stepped forward and held her shoulders. Her brothers stared at the children and then at Egli, trying to decide whether to smile or to shout. They did both. Egli stayed for a time. Her children ran in the yard. They touched chickens and laughed. They ate bread and drank milk. They slept on benches near the hearth. They asked questions about every object. They asked why smoke rose from the roof. They asked why people kept animals inside wooden walls. Egli watched them and felt relief and worry at once, because she had brought river children into a village that did not understand them. Her brothers watched too. They saw the children's strange ease around water. They saw the way the children stood still when they heard snakes moving in grass. They decided Gilvinus had taken too much from their family. They pressed Egli for the secret phrase. She refused. They asked again. She refused again. They waited until the children went out to play. They followed them and offered sweets and small gifts. They asked the phrase as if it were a game. The youngest child spoke first. Then another confirmed it. The phrase left their mouths and entered the brothers' ears. The brothers returned to the river without telling Egli. They stood on the bank and shouted the phrase. Gilvinus rose from the water. He appeared first as a snakehead breaking the surface, then as a man lifting up from the river with water running down his chest. He looked toward the shore and saw the brothers holding clubs and axes. He opened his mouth to speak. One brother swung an axe and struck him in the shoulder. Another struck him across the head. Gilvinus fell back into the water. Blood spread in the current. The brothers kept striking until he stopped moving. They dragged the body to the bank and left it there, water running from it onto the mud. They turned and walked away with tight faces and fast breathing. Egli sensed the change before anyone told her. She walked to the river with her children behind her. She saw the water running clear and then saw dark color near the bank. She stepped closer and saw the body. She covered her mouth with her hand. She knelt. Her fingers touched wet hair and cold skin. She looked up at her brothers. Their faces held hard expressions. They did not speak. Egli stood. Her children gathered around her legs. They looked at the body and began to cry. Egli's face stayed rigid. She reached down and held each child by the shoulder and turned them away from the river. She spoke to her children with a flat voice and told them to stand in a line. They stood. They shook. She looked at each one and spoke words that changed their bodies. She changed them into trees. One became an oak. One became an ash. One became a birch. One became a trembling aspen. Their human forms vanished. Trunks rose from the ground where they had stood. Branches spread. Leaves appeared. The transformation left no blood. It left wood and bark and roots pushing into soil. Egli stepped back and stared at the new trees. Her mouth tightened. Then she changed herself. In some tellings, she became a spruce or a fir. In others, she became a tree with drooping branches. Her human body vanished, and a trunk stood in her place. The village yard held new trees where a family had stood minutes before. People walked past those trees for years. They touched bark. They broke off small twigs. They pointed the children to them and told them to keep their voices low. They used the story to explain why certain trees shook in wind, because the aspen leaves flutter easily and make a constant sound. They used the story to warn against betrayal. They used the story to warn against bargains with creatures from water. They used the story to explain why grief sometimes stays longer than a lifetime. On the coast, people continued to pick up amber after storms, rubbing sand off with rough thumbs. Inland, people continued to hang rowan and iron near cradles, leaving small offerings by the hearth. Both kinds of stories stayed in circulation because the land provided proof in physical things. Amber sat in a palm. Trees stood in a yard. Lightning split a trunk. A river carried dark color when something bled. People remembered with their hands and eyes. Men on horseback rode into a village at the edge of a sacred grove. Their boots were muddy. Their cloaks held rainwater in dark patches. A wooden cross rose from the led rider's saddle, tied on with cord. Behind them walked men on foot, carrying axes and bundles of stakes. The villagers watched from doorways and from behind fences. Some held babies against their chests. Some held pitchforks with the tines resting on the ground. A dog barked and then stopped when one rider turned his head and stared at it. The riders halted near the largest oak. The oak stood in the center of a small clearing, trunk thick, bark cut with old offerings and old knife marks. A ring of stones sat at its base. Ash from past fires lay scattered among the stones. A man in a simple robe stepped forward from the riders. He held a book in one hand and a small vessel in the other. He spoke out loud. The words did not match the village language. People still understood the purpose. The man sprinkled water toward the oak and then raised the book again. Two men with axes walked to the trunk. They placed their hands on the bark for a moment, then stepped back and swung. The first blow cut into the wood and left a pale wound. Chips flew. The second blow landed lower. The third landed higher. The rhythm settled. Axe head striking, wood cracking, breath forced out. The oak did not fall quickly. It held. It swayed once when a gust of wind hit its crown. The men kept swinging. Villagers watched with tight faces. An old woman took a small piece of bread from her apron pocket and held it in her fist until it crushed. A boy stepped forward and then stopped when his mother caught his shoulder and pulled him back. When the oak fell, it landed with a heavy sound that shook the ground. Branches snapped. Leaves scattered. The men with stakes moved in and began driving them into the earth around the stump. They hammered fast. The man in the robe walked the circle and spoke again. A few villagers crossed themselves because they had seen others do it. Others kept their hands still at their sides. Nobody shouted. Nobody ran. Everyone watched. That night, a fire burned in a hearth in the same village. A woman banked the coals and covered them with ash. She placed a small crumb of bread near the hearthstone with 2 fingers. She did it with a quick motion and a glance toward the door. Her husband sat on a bench and sharpened a knife on a stone. The sound stayed steady. Their child slept on a pallet, thumb in mouth. Outside, the new stake stood around the stump like a fence around a grave. In the distance, thunder sounded once. A weak rumble. The couple paused. The husband set the knife down. The woman lifted her head. They listened. No second rumble came. The husband picked the knife up again and kept sharpening. The woman lay down beside the child and stared at the ceiling until sleep came.